Now let's look at the development of thought and language. Thought in psychology is referred to as cognition. So this is cortical function or frontal lobe function, and after the outer parts of the brain are myelinated, and you start to see progression through the Piagetian stages, you see the development of the ability to take perspective, solve problems, and improvement in the storage of information. The principal theorist in cognitive theory is Jean Piaget, who was a Swiss developmental psychologist. Piaget developed a system of levels and stages with a model for how young children proceed through these stages to gain in their ability to think and store information and problem solve. So if you look at all the stage theorists, Sigmund Freud and the psychosexual stages, Erik Erikson and the psychosocial stages, Lawrence Kohlberg and the moral development stages, the best way to think of all of the stages is to put Piaget in the middle and look at everything associated with Piaget, as well as understanding the development of cognition. The development of memory, because the central process that predisposes all of these stages, the predispositions for all of these stages, is cognitive development. So it is in the middle. Now Piaget, the way he framed the process for achieving cognitive function was through assimilation and accommodation. This process is called equilibration. So the best way to really understand accommodation is to look at it from a building perspective, how schemata in the brain are built. And that is that you have the simplest form first, what your the limitations in experience that young children have. So the best way to really look at this is to look at an example. So, and we talked about this before. So a child that will have perhaps their only experience with animals will be their pet, which would, in most cases, is a dog. And the symbolic representation of dog is the sound of the word doggy. So what will happen is if they come in contact with another animal, or when they come in contact with another animal, the tendency will be to incorporate that new animal in with what they already know, which is doggy. So they tend to over-include that animal in the schema furry, four-legged, non-human, which would call it, and that's why they would refer to it as doggy. At which point someone will make the correction, and so that's called assimilation when they use the term doggy for any furry, four-legged, non-human, but that's not correct. So accommodation is the process of giving a new label. They see the traits, they get the new label, and accommodation is building a new schema. And so that would be, a cow would be a furry, four-legged, non-human, non-dog. So now you've got something different. And the traits that they can see in the difference between a dog and a cow become obvious, and they build a new schema. And then, as they come across other animals that are furry and four-legged and non-human and non-cow and non-dog, then they build more subcategories. Now, eventually, these accommodations are going to work out, the equilibrations are going to work out to be broader schematic networks, like all the category of things that are, for example, farm animals, which may not have exactly the same traits, but involve deeper variables like what does it do or where do you find it. So a chicken, a cow, a horse, a pig might all be in one schema of a broader category called farm animals. And so people will get divided up into farm animals. These are, into schemata, like these are my family members, and these are humans that are not my family members. and on and on. So the Piaget says this process just continues and gets more complex and broader, and eventually will become more abstract. So the way a schema works, a schema is a concept category, and it's like the folders on your computer. So a schema has a best representative example of things in that schema. That is the ideal representation of what goes in that schema, like the label on a folder. And that's called a prototype. So a prototype is an ideal representation, and it has the central traits of everything that belongs in that schema or in that category. So similarity to the prototype determines how close to the ideal representation it is. So now, categorical members can become a part of an exemplar. So exemplars are the comparisons of things to that prototype. So some things are ideal exemplars to the prototype, and some things are very remote representations of what goes to the prototype. Interestingly enough, the faster the closer an object is to the ideal representation, the closer it is as an exemplar to the prototype, the faster we encode it and the faster we can retrieve it. So ideally, exemplars that are very close to the prototype tend to be encoded quickly. And as we gain new information, which is called knowledge, get a knowledge base, a schematic network of all the things we know about a topic, what we find is the more we know about a topic, the faster we are at associating new things in with the prototypes and exemplars that are in that topic area. That's why the more you know, the easier it is to know more. So you can look at the process of equilibration as a cycle. So we're building a schema. We assimilate, and then we compare the exemplar to the prototype and accommodate by building a new schema, and then we build a schematic network, and then the schematic networks will start to cluster. And operating within that network saves us a great deal of time. So this really looks a lot like file compression. You know, why you can get thousands of songs on an iPad or your cell phone, on your cell phone or like a device, how we can store very large amounts of information on a relatively small space, like a DVD that can hold more than one movie. And that's because of file compression. So file compression works something like equilibration in that it tends to take the commonalities in files and store them separately, and then all you have to do when you put a new file in there is it compares it to the files you already have, and then it only saves the nuance or the difference. And then when you retrieve it, it retrieves the common file with the nuance or the new file and combines them to play. That way you don't have to resave the commonalities. And that's exactly how our brain works. It saves all the commonalities in the common files. Those are the concept categories, like things that share traits. And then you have the differences in those traits stored separately. So let's look at the first Piagetian stage. It's the sensorimotor period. And look at that word, sensorimotor. And it tells you exactly what that stage is. Sensory information in, motor information out, and nothing in between. There's really not any cognition at this point. This is in very young children. So in neonates and in very early infancy, you can say that stimuli in the environment are out of sight, out of mind. That means that when mom's in front of the baby's face, mom exists. When mom leaves the room, mom doesn't exist. There's some sense of familiarity with mom's face, mom's voice, or someone else's face or voice that have been seen before, but there's no concept of mom outside of the experience of mom's presence. So the sensory motor substage is actually a precognitive stage during which there will be several substages in the sensory motor period until you get to your first cognition, your first mental representation, which is object permanence. So the beginning is actually patterning, and those are called reflexive schemes. So newborns you'll start to see patterns in their reflexes. Now, really, you could actually explain these as operants from a behavioral standpoint. That is, things that are pleasurable get repeated and things that are not don't. But an example is a baby will be very completely random at first and reflexive, and the first substage will be primary circular reactions. So an example of a primary circular reaction would be an infant sucking their hand when it accidentally winds up in their mouth, and then you start to see a frequency of that become more common because it's reinforcing. So they get simple patterned motor habits, but very little anticipation of anything. It's just what's really in front of them. Secondary circular reactions are more anticipated, repeated, interesting effects in the world. So they'll imitate familiar behaviors and start to make sounds that they hear in the environment. Coordination of these secondary circular reactions are more intentional and goal-directed, like reaching for things and trying to pull in a blanket off of your face so they can see your face. So these are the earliest signs that they're going to develop object permanence, which is their understanding that a person or an object still exists when it's out of their sight. Tertiary circular reactions get more complex, and they start acting on objects in novel ways, like banging a spoon on their high chair to make a noise, and for beginning to look for objects. And this is right before object permanence. So their first mental representation is when, you know, the puppy leaves the room or mom leaves the room, or you put a ball in front of them and show it to them and then put it behind your back. And they look to see where it goes and where it's gone. And when they do, that's when they have their first mental representation. And once object permanence sits in, they're transitioning from the sensory motor stage to the preoperational thought stage. And in the preoperational thought stage, they know people exist when they're not in front of them. They have some sense of naive physics, which is the ball's rolling across the floor and rolls under the sofa, and they expect it to come out the other side. So they'll look to see it come out the other side. This is simple momentum or an understanding of kind of how things work. Like sitting in a high chair and dropping peas over the side, or carrots, you know, to watch them ascend to the floor. It's kind of a naive sense of gravity. It would be shocking to them if they let go of the pea and it floated up into the air. They expect it to fall to the floor. So they already have a intuitive sense for basic physics. This is also when you start to see the development of the use of symbols, like gesturing or pointing or reaching with a gesture that says they want something. They make certain noises. And then they will actually start to develop words as symbols. That is, and what tends to happen is you get word understanding before you get word usage. So they'll understand what a word means before they're able to say it. So you might say, "Where's mommy?" and they'll point to mother. "Where's doggy?" and they'll point to the dog. But at that point, they may not actually be able to say the word mom or dog. So expectation and surprise studies are what they or how you can tell if they have if they've developed object permanence and if they still have a concept in their mind. So one of the tests for that is to actually show them something and then put it behind an object, a barrier where they can't see it, then drop the barrier, and if it's not there, the child shows some surprise. There's a ball and cup exercise that's like that, where you take 2 cups and put a ball under it, and then make it clear, show them where the cup with the ball is going and where the cup without the ball is, and then use a little sleight of hands to get the ball out from under the cup without them seeing it, and then raise the cup and they look and it's not there and they show surprise. One of the important research tools that was developed for the study of infants is the looking chamber. The looking chamber is a box that has sensors that can pick up where their gaze is and plot it on a picture or a chart. And it also measures gaze time. So that's how long they look at one object versus another. So there's a variety of tasks that can be completed in the looking chamber, visual tasks and auditory. And it's a good way to study a lot of features of infant vision and perception. So one of the early uses of the looking chamber was served to answer the question, do they have any biological predisposition for the recognition of faces, or do they prefer one kind of stimulus over another? So looking chamber studies have shown that infants prefer patterns over random stimuli. So you could have 2 images in the screen on the top of the looking chamber. You place the infant inside of it, and you measure the gaze time, and a patterned stimulus tends to have a longer gaze time for random stimuli. So that's why they if you take them near mini blinds or something like that, that'll catch their attention. It's thought that that's kind of an indication that for survival purposes, patterned stimuli are more important than random stimuli in the environment. So the next question was, do they have any kind of predisposition for faces over non-faces? So as you can see here, there are 4 stimuli, and one of them is a prototype face. So what they found in the looking chamber was that infants prefer patterns organized as faces, even when they're the same complexity as non-faces. The gaze time for faces is longer than random stimuli. They also found that they will, soon after the development of the visual system, begin to prefer familiar faces over stranger faces. So experiments were done in the looking chamber with a picture of mother's face beside the picture of someone similar to mother. So even though the faces were pretty similar, they found that gaze time for mother's face was longer than another female face that was similar. And so they could do a variety of experiments in the looking chamber looking at familiar faces versus non-familiar faces. A really interesting study was done by social psychologists looking at using the looking chamber to try to see if there was any predisposition for a preference for attractiveness. Like, for example, is what we consider attractive when we see someone's face, has that got any kind of biological roots? And so in looking chamber studies, they found, as you can see here too, there's 2 faces that vary very slightly, but only by symmetry. So they found that gaze time was significantly longer for the symmetrical face that got rated as higher in attractiveness than a non-symmetrical face rated as lower than attractiveness. So the social psychologists went on to actually even compare how people rate faces as far as attractiveness across cultures in different parts of the world, and they found that there's a significant amount of similarity even across cultures or regionality or other places in the world and how people rate faces as far as attractiveness. So that indicates that there's probably biological roots as to why we consider some appearances attractive and others less attractive. Now, one characteristic of toddlers in the preoperational thought stage is centration, which leads to egocentrism. One of the limitations in the toddler is that they have the inability to take another person's perspective. They're only able to consider one aspect of a situation at a time. So this is a really simplified form of cognition. Toddlers have very limited awareness of their own thought processes. That's metacognition. So they don't have much metacognition. They don't think about the problem they're solving. They don't think about what another person's thinking. So they do have reflective empathy. They, like babies will cry when another baby's crying. They'll make a sad face when someone else makes a sad face. That's not a sign of self-awareness, actually. That's actually just imitation. That imitation comes from mirror neurons in the brain. Mirror neurons are specialized neurons. We all have them. And they're what lead to imitation without intention. So, for example, you may notice that when someone is watching someone else tell a sad story, they may make a sad face. Those are your mirror neurons going off. Some people cry at movies whenever there's a sad moment in the movie. Nothing sad's happening to them, but it does trigger the mirror neurons. So when a baby's in a room full of other babies and they start crying, the mirror neurons go off. And babies smile when we smile at them. That's their mirror neurons going off. Okay, what's going to happen with development through the preoperational thought stage, it's eventually going to end it and start the concrete operation stage, is a process of decentration or decentering. Decentering is the process of holding one stimulus while manipulating another. And that's evidenced by some tasks, tests that you can do with them, like conservation of volume, conservation of space. And conservation of volume is when you take a tall container and pour it into a short container, showing them that the volume is is constant between two containers. They'll still, when you ask them which one holds more, they'll rely on a single characteristic of the fluid, which is the one that's taller holds more fluid, even though they can see that the volume is the same. They can't hold volume constant. Conservation of space is kind of similar when you have two representations spaced out differently and ask them which one is more, even though they have the same number of items in them. They'll tend to rely on the one that's taken up more space, the longer line of objects, even though it's the same number of objects. Decentration is going to be the predisposition for the development of empathy. That is the ability to take another person's perspective and the understanding that someone else may have a different perception of reality than you do. So it's laying the groundwork for empathy. So then when we start to look at infant imitation, and we see that as soon as the visual system comes in, we start to see imitative behaviors. Like, for example, if you smile at an infant, they'll smile back. If you place an infant in a room with crying infants, they'll cry themselves. So you see these kind of imitative behaviors before they've developed object permanence or any perceptions, and when behaviors are basically reflexive. So that leads to the theory that actually these imitations are more reflexes than they are any kind of intentional or reflective of a emotional kind of process. So that led to the discovery of mirror neurons in the brain. So mirror neurons are precursors to the development of empathy in that they are neurons that get triggered by sensory stimuli coming into the brain, mainly from the visual system. And it triggers the mirror neurons to fire off a response, an imitative response. So in other words, let's say an infant is exposed to a smiling face, then their mirror neurons would cause them to smile in response to the face. So they're not smiling because they're happy or because that's funny or because they love you. They're smiling because their mirror neurons are going off. Now, mirror neurons are not just present in infants. We have mirror neurons that work in the brain through the rest of development and into adulthood. It may explain what we find when we see someone in distress and we have imitative facial expressions to reflect that distress, or when people cry at movies, or when they're impacted emotionally by seeing someone else's emotion. That's probably in many cases our mirror neurons going off. So what purpose do mirror neurons serve? Well, first of all, they're, like I said, precursors to empathy. That is, they begin to set up that interactive response between observer and modeler. Also, when you look at Bandura's theory of modeling, observation and imitation, mirror neurons may serve a purpose in the observation and imitation process in Bandura's modeling behavior. That explains to a large extent why we can see some of these responses before we even have the underlying processes like cognition or complex emotions. We can see decentration in the preoperational thought stage in the three mountain problem. That is Piaget set up this problem where he had three mountains with objects in front and behind, set the baby on one side and the researcher on the other side, and then you ask the toddler what they see, or ask them, what do I see? And they'll reflect what they see. They don't understand that the mountain is obscuring the objects on your side. So you show them the objects on your side, then set them on the other side and ask them say, what's on my side? They're unable to imagine what's on your side, even though they've seen what's there. Toddlers do have an intuitive sense of biological concepts. The use of the word theories is not entirely accurate, because a theory would imply that you have enough metacognition and language and symbology to really be able to articulate what you're seeing or what you're reacting to. Toddlers don't necessarily have the ability to do that. So a more accurate term would be naive sort of intuition about biology, what sense they have about things. So, for example, they assume that if something has motion, then it's an animate object, and they'll associate motion with life. So, growth is an intuitive sense for things that are alive. They grow, they have internal parts, they can get sick and heal up. Those are just some things that kids have an intuitive sense about having to do with biology. Here's where we probably need to tune up some of the language. The core knowledge hypothesis is sort of a little bit of a misnomer. Knowledge is an accumulation of facts, symbols related to those facts and understandings. Infants aren't born with rudimentary knowledge of anything. They're not born with any kind of storage of facts. They're born with some predispositions for intuitive things, things like the ability to habituate pretty soon after their senses are active. They start to develop intuitive senses for experience, like we've talked about before, some of the sort of biological things like gravity, or physical things like gravity and momentum and things like that, but that's not really knowledge. If you ask an infant, so, how many meters per second is gravity accelerating towards the middle of the earth? They wouldn't have a sense about that. Or even what gravity is something being pulled towards the ground. They just have a sense that if you let go of something, or if they fall, that they're going to accelerate towards the floor until something stops them. So, that's why Descartes labeled the infant stage as tabula rasa, which means a slate that is blank, or a blank tablet, meaning that infants are born without any knowledge or instinct, and they have to be 100% nurtured, which is what we found. They have predispositions and they have reflexes, but they don't have instincts. Not like spiders do, or grasshoppers, or dogs or cats. You don't have to teach a dog to be territorial. They're naturally territorial. And birds naturally build nests and lay eggs. They're not taught that. They have that pre-programmed. So their world is basically intuitive, but it does involve expectation. So children develop a sense for the purpose of action. These are their teleological explanations that things have a purpose, but they don't necessarily have a belief about it. It's more of an intuitive sense of it. Now let's look at the Atkinson-Shiffrin memory store model, and we've talked about this before. It's really important to understand the relationship between the Atkinson-Shiffrin model and how memory works and the Piaget and cognitive stages, because understanding Piaget helps us to understand how memory improves as cognitive development gets better. That's why kids' memory is so much better after age 5 than it is before age 5. That's why children generally make really terrible witnesses, because their episodic autobiographical memory is just not really there yet. And articulating anything that they remember is a fairly weak thing. There are actually techniques for interviewing kids in the medical setting because that it's important to understand those. Like, for example, if you ask a child, where does it hurt? Then they might say, in my tummy. Well, for them, that could be anywhere from the base of their neck to their knees. So the whole middle part of their body. So what pediatric nurses or pediatricians do is they'll ask them, point to where it hurts. And it's interesting, you'll get a completely different response that way, because then they can give you a much more specific idea about where it hurts. Like, you ask a child, what does it feel like? And they'll say, it stings. So stings to them could be an ache, a burn, and it isn't going to tell you much because they're using a very limited descriptor. So that's why articulating memories gets really difficult for them. Interviewing kids, it takes some skill because of that. Now, let's look at some traits of their cognitive development and how that affects their memory. So the first thing that's important is that they have to have enough attention span or attentional ability or executive function to delay impulses long enough for a sensory stimulus to get input into their short-term memory. So the young children are pretty highly distractible, and that may limit the things that they notice and their input of information. Okay? Attention span is actually how long they can hold something in short-term memory through maintenance rehearsal. So the longer they can hold it in maintenance rehearsal, the more they can act on it in short-term memory, and the more likely they are to process it into long-term memory and build retrieval cues. Of course, emotional stimulation of any kind, those are things that improve short-term memory storage into long-term memory and retrieval. Certainly their memory is going to get significantly better when they start using symbols, like when they develop language. And then once they can store information in a long-term memory, the better they can elaborate, and that is getting deeper into the Piagetian stages, down and past the concrete operation stage and into the formal operation stage, where you get abstract reasoning and elaboration. That's when you're going to start to see significant improvement in their long-term memory. So let's look at a couple of developmental events that improve memory. One of them is executive function. That's the ability to inhibit distraction and intentionally focus attention. Lengthens maintenance rehearsal and allows time to build retrieval cues. So executive function, the better impulse control a child has, the better their executive function is, the better their memory is going to be. So decentering, like becoming more empathetic, being able to take the perspective of other people, understanding things at a deeper level deepens their processing, and that also improves memory. So the more elaborate their understanding of the world, the better their memory is going to be. Now you have two kinds of memory really at the fundamental level. You have semantic memory and episodic memory. And a type of episodic memory is memory for stories and sequences of events. Semantic memory is memory for facts and words. Semantic memory isn't automatic, so it usually requires a lot more concentration in building retrieval cues. Episodic memory is somewhat automatic, like anything put in story form or along a timeline. It's much easier for us to remember. And so that's why telling a story from beginning to end when you're laying out facts really helps in understanding or memorizing that sequence. Now, the kind of episodic memory that's automatic is autobiographical memory. So autobiographical memory is episodic memory that it's a memory for what you've done or what a person's done, their own life. And this keeps us oriented. So autobiographical memory goes from past to present to future. Future is prospective memory. So it also forms kind of an if-then scenario in the brain, which is a lot like a computer program. And that is if this happened in the past and the conditions are in the present are similar to that, then we can predict this outcome. So that's how autobiographical memory includes that timeline, which is in many cases context. Now, young children may have enough deficits in their understanding of what they're seeing that their memory doesn't have enough context to where they have an understanding they can store with the memory. So they may misinterpret situations. Another reason why they're really not very good eyewitnesses. Now, when they start to develop verbal skills, this gives objects in the environment, situations, and things like that. It gives them symbols and improves their ability to store information in a schematic network. So you get actually labels for things. Now, when you see an expansion of symbols like into adjectives and descriptors and ownership, then, of course, you're getting very elaborate. So personal experience is always going to store easier than someone else's experience because autobiographical memory, to keep us oriented, is stored automatically. And that's also why, in Alzheimer's patients or people with, traumatic brain injuries, when they lose their autobiographical memory, of course, in Alzheimer's patients, in late-stage Alzheimer's, when people lose their past, dementia sets in because they don't have the ability to store new information and they don't have any references to the past, so they get increasingly confused. Now, we talked about learning, but let's just kind of review through the items we went through, the theories we went through having to do with learning. Beginning with learning in psychology being a broad definition, that is, any change in an organism resulting from exposure to a stimulus. So learning can occur at our level of awareness or below our level of awareness. And we have parts in the brain that learn at our level of awareness, like the frontal cortex and the motor functions that we're actually aware of, our procedural memory. And then we have memory at below our level of awareness, which is our automatic memory, that is our cerebellar muscle memory and pattern memories that may be below our level of awareness. So learning is habituation, sensitization, and even orienting responses are all part of the learning process. We went through the learning theorists. The ones that we were really focused on was Pavlov and Skinner and Bandura, which is not on this. There's no picture of Bandura. That's interesting. But we've got Ivan Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, and Albert Bandura and Julian Rotter. And those are the theorists that are the most relevant for development. You know, we can, some of these people are contributing theorists, some of them are the originators. So just as a review, we'll look at Pavlov's contribution, and then Skinner's incorporation of Pavlov into his model, Bandura's incorporation of cognition into Skinner's model, and Julian Rotter's incorporation of expectation and locus of control in Bandura's model. So just briefly, the classical conditioning model is based on the magic word pairing. You're pairing two stimuli in the environment, one an unconditioned stimulus and one a neutral stimulus, until the neutral stimulus changes to a conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus then elicits the same behavior as the unconditioned stimulus. So the reason he called it an unconditioned stimulus is because it occurs naturally. Okay, so fear in response to a spider is an unconditioned stimulus. If you pair the spider with a certain situation, like you know, your room or the inside of a car or a person, then the person can associate that, pair it, and then that unconditioned stimulus can produce an unconditioned that can produce a conditioned stimulus, and that'll give you a conditioned response. Conditioned response is something that doesn't happen naturally. Now, why is this important? Because there's all kinds of things that we can do with this when we're aware of it in parenting, teaching, even and just understanding how the environment in general affects a person. One thing that Pavlov found once he discovered the process of classical conditioning in his experiment with the dog and the salivary response was that he could undo this. He thought, well, if it occurs naturally, then I should be able to undo it. And he was. He was able to undo it by unpairing. So he figured out that he had paired an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, and then produced a conditioned stimulus, which was producing a conditioned response. And all he had to do at that point was produce the conditioned stimulus without the response, and sure enough, it went back to neutral. So that was Pavlov's correction of his, or Pavlov's stimulus. So you have acquisition and extinction. So we talked before about bullying at school and how that can lead to an aversive reaction to school and the stimuli at school, and you know how that can result from a bully or humiliation or things like that. Think about other situations where you have two stimuli paired to where one becomes an elicitor of the same response as a more natural response. That is, you've paired the stimulus until now something that wasn't frightening before became frightening, or something that wasn't pleasant before became pleasant. And how that can be used in the teaching environment, parenting environment, or clinical environment. Now, when you look at classical conditioning applications, think of, in the position of a teacher or a parent, what kinds of stimulus pairings can be planned in the interaction with kids to improve or have them associate positive emotions or positive sensations with the environment that they're in, so that they develop an affinity for the place they are, like the classroom or even at home, wanting your child to enjoy coming to the dinner table and engage in family conversations and things like that, or want to spend time in the living room with the rest of the family and activities. Those are enhanced, those activities, desired responses are enhanced by these stimulus pairings. Is the place a pleasant place? Does it elicit positive emotions by the fact that the stimulus environment is being paired with pleasant things. And on the other hand, do we think about stimulus pairings that we don't want? Like, should they be dressed down for things that they failed to do when they're at the dinner table? Maybe not a good idea. If you're a teacher, you have to avoid humiliation or anxiety or provoking anger or frustration in the classroom whenever you can. So that's something that teachers can keep in mind, always keeping in mind that they want the classroom paired with sort of pleasant emotions. Even the physical stimuli in the environment in the classroom tend to have an effect on how someone responds emotionally to that environment, whether they realize it or not. These are latent processes. They're below the level of awareness. For example, they did studies on classrooms with windows versus classrooms with no windows, because there was sort of a no window craze that went on in the 80s with building schools with no windows. Some of you might have attended schools with no windows. And the sort of logic behind eliminating windows in the construction of schools was this idea that windows are distracting and it's better not to have windows because the kids will look out the windows and things like that. That was done with no evidence, by the way, which often we make decisions like that with no evidence. And there may have been a secondary benefit in that it's much cheaper to build a building with no windows than windows, much cheaper. So could have been some motivation there. But whenever they started looking at that and measuring and doing some research, what they found is actually attentional abilities are better when there are windows, because when there's windows and daylight that can come in the room, and the outside visibility of the outside tends to serve as a background for what's going on in the classroom, there's actually a heightened state of alertness and wakefulness. And kids being under fluorescent lighting in a room with no windows all day long, the sinking spell you get in the afternoon is actually worse. Why isn't the window distracting? Well, mainly because they habituate to the window. So they're not drawn to stare out the window constantly, because after they've initially looked out the window, the whole stimulus environment out there outside the window, they habituate to it. It's not interesting anymore. It's not novel. So they don't have a tendency to be drawn to the window and distracted by the window. So it basically boils down to getting daylight in the room and having a kind of an open, pleasant environment. And we can look at some applications of Skinner and operant conditioning, because even though this is influenced by Pavlov and Watson, Skinner builds a model that also looks at consequences. So you can pull up the behavior analysis flowchart and get kind of an idea, a reminder, a review of Skinner. But what's important about Skinner is that there are many, many change agents in Skinner, because you're dealing with what happens before the behavior with the stimulus environment, and you're also dealing with what happens after the behavior to strengthen, weaken, or maintain it. So Skinner, when you look at the pairing of stimuli before the behavior and the consequences of the stimuli after the behavior, provides a pretty strong model for ways to shape, maintain, or alter behavior. Now let's look at some considerations for the Skinner model in behavior analysis, and what have we found from the research that can tell us what makes these more effective. So you have operant conditioning. You have consequences that are punishers and consequences that are reinforcers. Punishers are actually defined as anything that decreases the strength of a response, and reinforcers are anything that increases the strength of a response. So you have positive punishers, which means it's some kind of an aversive stimulus that follows a response, and negative punishers, which are when you remove social contact, or that's what's called a timeout, only it's so you just remove any kind of positive outcome. in reinforcers, you have positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. Positive reinforcers are just anything that follows a response that increases the strength of the response. Negative reinforcers being where the response is followed by the removal of something that's aversive. Also avoiding some kind of an aversive stimulus is negatively reinforcing as well. So, for example, if you avoid something that tends to induce fear, then that's negatively reinforcing. That happens when people with anxiety disorders avoid the anxiety-provoking stimulus, and that strengthens the anxiety. And that can be a problem in clinical settings with phobias and condition aversions. So some considerations here. You have a stimulus, a response, and a consequence. And that consequence can be a reinforcer, a negative reinforcer, a positive reinforcer, a negative reinforcer, or a punisher, or the withdrawal of an aversive stimulus of some kind. So the time consideration gets important here. So, for example, if someone is attempting to use punishers in some way to change a behavior, then the longer the time between the response and the consequence, the weaker the response is at affecting the consequence. So immediate reinforcers and immediate punishers tend to be more effective than delayed reinforcers, delayed punishers. So when trying to affect behavior, that is decrease the frequency of a behavior or get rid of an unwanted behavior, there's really two ways to do that. One is to actually punish the behavior, so elicit or provide some kind of a negative consequence of the response. The more effective way to do that is to allow a naturally occurring punisher. So if the response has an inherent naturally negative consequence, just staying out of the way and allowing that consequence to take place tends to temporarily link that behavior with the consequence. I mean, the consequence, and it's more effective at naturally reducing the strength of the response. So that's the way the world generally teaches us to avoid dangerous, noxious, or non-positive behaviors by providing natural punishers. So that happens when you eat something that and it makes you sick to your stomach, or when we in the natural world, when we're mean to somebody and then they don't want to talk to us anymore. Now the other way to weaken a behavior is to identify the reinforcer that strengthened it to begin with and that's maintaining it, and remove that reinforcer. That's called extinction. So, for example, with bullies, their behavior is usually maintained by the attention they get from bullying or the sense of power they get. So when there's some kind of a vacuum created where they don't get that kind of desired feedback, they don't have a sense of power, then you can get extinction of bullying behavior. Talking back, talking disrespectfully, things like that. Those are behaviors that usually strengthened because they were reinforced in some way or another. So behavior analysts will look for the reinforcer that is maintaining or strengthening the behavior and try to remove that. And so that's actually what a true timeout is. If you're sticking somebody in a timeout chair in the corner, that's actually a punisher. A timeout is an extinction procedure. So that would be more like if somebody said something to you that was disrespectful and you just walked away. You just said, okay, I don't want to talk to you. Then, and removed any kind of social response to that, then that would be more along the line of providing a extinguishing response. Now, the Premack Principle was something that was developed in behavior analysis we talked about before. And it's a cognitive behavioral principle. And what it has to do with is providing access to a desired behavior after performing a less desired behavior. If you get complete a task and that you don't want to do, you're allowed to engage in a task that you do want to do. If you eat some food that you don't find that preferable, then you get to have some kind of food that you do find preferable. There is a downside to the Premack principle, and that is that it may tend to degrade any naturally reinforcing aspect of the behavior. For example, if you complete your homework only to get to play a game or video games or something like that, what that does is that temporally has a negative impact on the sense of achievement for doing homework. It may get in the way of that and actually devalue homework even more. It may actually encourage to some degree procrastination. The other problem is that the tendency to weaken the natural sort of sense of achievement in doing some task, doing your homework, completing your chores, something like that. It may shift the attention only to working for a goal. And so it may weaken the naturally reinforcing, intrinsically reinforcing aspect of completing a task, like I got that done. So as was discussed before, the punishment was, when it's compared with reinforcement, tends to be weak in terms of its endurance, its resistance to extinction. So punishment is anything that follows a response that decreases the frequency, intensity, or duration of that response. And so, but that doesn't mean that punishers are, completely avoidable, or that there's something inherently wrong with punishers, that you should never experience punishers. Actually, the opposite is true. The environment naturally provides punishers. So the trick here is to make a negative consequence that's designed to be a punisher. You want to weaken a behavior, is to make it as logically associated or make it as much a logical consequence with that behavior as possible. So really, the most ineffective punishers are the arbitrary ones, where the punishment itself has absolutely nothing to do with the behavior you're trying to get rid of. And so that's when the punisher becomes ineffective, and it doesn't generalize. So thinking about, okay, well, what is a logical consequence here? And letting that natural consequence happen, or providing it, is more likely to serve as an operant teaching tool to weaken that behavior. And then, as we talked about before, providing an alternative to reinforce. Which brings us to why spankings are generally ineffective. I mean, there is such thing as a effective spanking, and that would be, a SWAT having to do with an action to elicit a startle response or mimic a consequence, like we talked about before, reaching for a hot pan on the stove and getting smacked in the hand. Mimics what would happen if you touched it and burned yourself, or being startled, like a little kid's running for the street and the parent grabs them and gives them a swat on the bottom, while they're focused on the street, and then points out, well, you're going to get run over by a car. And so they're supposed to be, you want to frighten them at that point, because that's the teaching process. So, and so that's when spankings are the most effective. Arbitrary spankings tend to be ineffective, and the reason is because whenever the spanking is arbitrary, the reason spanking your dog doesn't do any good, or when there's some kind of a ritualistic spanking with kids, like using a paddle or belt, or inflicting any kind of pain, is a problem in punishers. And the reason is because pain draws attention away from the thing that you're trying to get them to focus on. The thing you're trying to punish and draws it inside. So pain draws your attention to inside your experience. And so when kids, for example, are being spanked in a way that inflicts pain on them, their focus is on the pain. Just like if you swat your dog, their focus is on the fear of being swatted, but the dog doesn't make some kind of logical connection, and kids don't either. So when they're being spanked and the spanking is real painful, they tend not to focus on the thing that is they're being spanked for, and they focus on the pain. So the pain becomes actually a distractor. You know, paradoxically, you don't really want to use pain as a punisher. So think about some naturally occurring consequences in different settings, like a naturally occurring consequence for a boss that's dealing with employees, or naturally occurring consequences for parents that are trying to guide their kids, or naturally occurring consequences for teachers that are trying to teach students. What you find is that naturally occurring consequences are actually available most of the time. It's rare when you run into some kind of a behavior and there is no naturally occurring consequence for that, especially in any kind of behavior that's in personal interaction. So, for example, you know, common problems like little kids hitting their other little kids, their siblings, you know, and the natural sort of consequence for that is you lose the privilege of playing with your sibling. And most of the time, not too long after the offense, they're going to want to play with their siblings. So that's a natural consequence. Absence of attention from the parent, if they're disrespectful, is a natural consequence. Generally, if you're disrespectful with people, if you talk to them in a rude manner or anything like that, then they generally don't want to spend time with you or be around you. So that's a natural consequence. So again, avoiding any kind of arbitrary consequence in place of natural consequences will be counterproductive. So you might spend a little bit of time thinking about what competing responses are. Like a behavior analyst will look at a behavior they don't want. Distraction, disruption, aggression, disrespect, procrastination. They'll look at a behavior they don't want, and they think of the behavior that is its antecedent. What is the opposite of that behavior? So strategically, that's what a behavior analyst does. They look at the behavior that's the opposite. Now, if you take a cognitive behavioral approach to that, you don't even have to actually wait for the behavior to occur. You can provide a prompt that prompts the opposite behavior so that it gives you an opportunity to reinforce it. And that's what a really good teacher, a really good parent, even a really good boss would do. They would prompt a behavior they want by making the reinforcer obvious, that this is going to happen if you can get this done. In that situation, you can actually see an opportunity to strengthen a competing response, because if you strengthen a competing response, the behavior you don't want will go away. Now here's an opportunity to think about intrinsic versus extrinsic reinforcers. You know, what are some intrinsic reinforcers and what are some extrinsic reinforcers? And in this situation, when you compare the two, if you have intrinsic reinforcers available, they're preferable over extrinsics. And so it doesn't mean that, you know, we don't ever benefit from extrinsic reinforcers, but whenever intrinsic reinforcers are available and they can be made obvious, then they are going to be more stable and better than extrinsic reinforcers as far as long-term goals. And now with kids, you know, that can start happening at a fairly early in life, where they begin to get an intuitive sense for the world of intrinsic reinforcement: attention, affection, mastery, success, goal achievement, those kinds of things. Now, you know, what's interesting is there's a personality trait called need achievement. We'll talk about that was developed by Henry Murray years ago in the motivation literature. Need achievement is a kind of a trait, and you'll find that some kids have real high levels of need achievement. And high need achievers tend to be easily intrinsically reinforced because they have an intrinsic sort of good response to achieving things. So high need achievers will be in a rush to get things done. They tend to avoid, they tend not to procrastinate. They tend to, they're more reinforced whenever they complete a task or by being good at something or being successful. And that's why you see high need achievers among high performers. And so in general, the process is to avoid reinforcement shift. And unfortunately in the world, there's a lot of tendency to rely on extrinsic reinforcers, and it's even a lot in our language. You know, and sometimes taken to ridiculous extremes, like, you know, when people are focused on monetary gain beyond what's even beneficial to them, and sacrificing their intrinsic life for monetary gain. That is, sacrificing experience and pleasantness or relationships for purely for extrinsic reinforcement. So that's kind of you know, the being stuck on the wheel, you know, that you see so much driven by the corporate world sometimes. And so trying to avoid reinforcement shift is real important, because at an early age people can be socialized to really focus on intrinsic reinforcement. Okay, now let's look at some cognitive development, some principles that are going to be relative to school, starting in really before preschool. And that is the way we acquire certain cognitive tasks that are going to wind up being arithmetic tasks or organizational tasks later on in life. And the first one, probably the simplest one we start with, is the stable order principle, which is called ordinality. We learn ordinality when we learn to recite the order of things. So ordinality when it comes to numbers is when we learn to recite numbers in order, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we recite the numbers in order. Ordinality when it comes to is also consistent with the alphabet, being able to say the alphabet in order, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and this, and you say it in order, okay? And so that's generally how kids start dealing with numbers. They don't deal with the meaning of numbers in any way or the arithmetic relevance of numbers. They just learn to recite the numbers. Cardinality is what separates the alphabet from counting, and that is that the alphabet doesn't have cardinality, and that in other words, A doesn't have a different value than B, doesn't have a different value than C, doesn't have a different value than D. They just fall in order. They're labels of order. Cardinality, however, does have relevance with numbers. So 2 is twice as many as 1, and 3 times is 3 times as many as 1. And what cardinality means is that when you go up the order of numbers, the last number you get to represents how many the quantity, or what the quantity is within that number. So 5 things, if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are 5 things that are represented by the number 5. So this is the root that begins to build an understanding of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Let's look at the simplest concept in social development, because we're going to be talking about Erikson and psychosocial development. But let's look at actually a simpler psychosocial development theory that was proposed by a Russian developmental psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky proposed that looked at the interaction between the child and the caregiver, and how the caregiver puts effort into the task for the child to help them complete the task, and then over time how the child acquires their ability from the caregiver by being aided in completing the task. Vygotsky called that the zone of proximal development. So what happens is that as the caregiver is giving effort to the child is able to complete the task, and then over time, the child masters the task and then becomes functionally autonomous at the task. So before we talked about teaching a kid to ride a bicycle by hanging onto the handlebars until they can balance and master the task for themselves. We talked about kind of the social zone of proximal development and the difference in, how much space little kids manage versus how much they're going to manage when they get older. And so that's how the scaffolds are built. And that's really our simplest version of social development. So one of the ways that Vygotsky looks at the zone of proximal development is as sort of in a concentric set of skills. So you have acquired abilities, and that's where the person is in the present. And then scaffolds that are constructed to help them progress to what are called future potentials. So you have potential abilities that are the goals for the kinds of tasks as they progress through the zone of proximal development through the scaffolds to get to those potential abilities and goals. And you can see this clearly in developing athletic skills, cognitive or academic skills, and in music training. And that is that, pretty specific levels or scaffolds that set up a clear goal to master before they can move on to the next goals. That's why we tend to have terms like beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Those are scaffolds. We tend to even change the rule in children's sports to make it clear what their abilities are going to need to be for the specific level they're on. Like T-ball, for example. You don't have a pitcher, and because kids can't pitch at that point, so what their ability needs to be is they need to be able to go up, hit the ball off the tee, and then they're instructed by base coaches to run to the base because, in T-ball, what they do is they hit the ball and then they just kind of stand there because it was way cool to hit the ball. And then the first base coach says, run over here. But they're actually not thinking about, I'm going to score and this is a game and I'm competing against people. It's basically one step at a time. There's the tee. I get to hit the ball, yay. And then we go to first base because somebody told me to run there. And then when I go all the way around the bases, we do that. And then eventually we get soda pop or lemonade. So, and then the next level up is going to be coach pitch, when you have to actually hit a ball that's thrown to you at a coach. And kids will begin to, at that point, start to understand the nature of the game a little bit. But it doesn't take long before kids are pitching to batters, and there's certain cues that are given by the base coaches, but the kids know if you smack the ball, you go heading off to first base, and then if somebody else hits the ball, you go from first to second, and they can tag you out, and it gets more and more complicated. But when you start adding strategy and all that in there, then you're in the higher or advanced levels of scaffolding. And so the truth is that you see this in a variety of tasks. It's just kind of the way we handle learning and build learning strategies. So let's look at language development. This is a really important aspect of development. It begins actually with an old argument that developed between a psycholinguist named Noam Chomsky and a radical behaviorist named B.F. Skinner. This took place in the 50s and early 60s. Skinner had developed a model of learning of language using the operant theory, and he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior. And in it, he describes all of these very complex models for how kids are reinforced to speak in certain ways, and that they learn through a series of reinforcers and cues. And he described it in this real elaborate process in the book. Noam Chomsky at the time was a psycholinguist, and he's a cognitivist. And he pointed out some real weaknesses in Skinner's model, because what Skinner couldn't explain was why kids make certain common mistakes. Like they say things like, I learned it, and I want my bathing suit, and things like that. Common errors. Things that they're not reinforced for saying, and aren't even modeled for them. We don't start out talking to kids that way. So Chomsky's proposal is that language is actually a naturally occurring process that operates in the brain. And he had this structure that he describes called the language acquisition device. And the language acquisition device was this tendency in the brain to acquire language just simply by being exposed to it. So you acquire the ability to understand language by being exposed to people that are speaking to you, and you hear it, and over time the child naturally acquires the ability to understand it. And then at some point after that, they mimic and imitate the language that they're exposed to, and they acquire the ability to speak it. So this is called nativist theory, and it actually explains what we see in language acquisition much better than the Operant model does, because what we know about language is that first of all, you can't speak a language you can't understand, so understanding a language takes precedent over speaking it. But you can actually acquire the ability to understand a language that you cannot speak. So you'll notice that in bilingual households where the parents are speaking, for example, maybe the parents speak Spanish and the child speaks English, and they can communicate that way in two different languages at the same time. What that means from Chomsky's model is that they're bilingual for understanding, that the parents and the child are, but they're only monolingual for speaking. The parents speak Spanish and the child responds in English, and they sort of mix the language. So that aligns a lot more with Chomsky's language acquisition device. We also know that language is acquired in the first 5 years, the rudiments of it are, and that they acquire language in the first 5 years, and after that, they gradually have to learn it. So if you've been exposed to a language before age 5, you just naturally acquire it. And you can naturally acquire as many languages and dialects as you're exposed to. So that dispels a myth that one language interferes with another. So kids kind of go through this process. Utterances first, which is just cooing, then babbling, which is when they kind of imitate sentences. They imitate what you sound like without being able to actually make language. Holophrastic speech is when they use like single words or a word or two to sort of illustrate a whole sentence. Like they may say, mine, and that means, I think that belongs to me. I'd appreciate it if you give it to me. Telegraphic speech is when they speak in phrases, but they're not complete sentences. And then sentence completions when they actually acquire the intuition for what a complete sentence is. That, they sense that complete sentences sound a certain way. Now, this happens at the intuitive level. They're not actually diagramming sentences or anything like that. They may not even know what nouns, verbs, adverbs, pronouns, prepositions. They may not even be even aware of any of this stuff, but they have a sense for, when they create language, what a complete sentence sounds like. Well, it turns out Chomsky's language acquisition device lines up pretty nicely with the way the brain's organized. On the left side of the brain, which is where most people's language center is, you have an area there at the temporal parietal area of the brain, right about where your auditory tract is, called Wernicke's area, and that's where speech understanding is. The basic sounds of language are stored in these auditory association areas, and they're specific for the language that you speak. So, for example, of the language that you understand. So you expect that words will have certain sounds. Broca's area is an area in the sort of frontal area in the brain, and this is your speech production area. The Broca's area it allows you to take language, from an idea from the frontal lobe, from the cognitive center, and create a sentence from it. And so it will have signals that go to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex will actually initiate all of the actions that are required for you to be able to speak. So that involves a very complex pathway. The motor cortex, the basal ganglia, the feedback loops of the sensory motor cortex, the cerebellum for coordination of the muscles, diaphragmatic control, and voice pitch and all that stuff. So that's all done in Broca's area. So if you were to lose your ability to understand language, like you were having a CVA, a stroke in Wernicke's area, that would be called Wernicke's aphasia. You'd be able to speak, but you wouldn't be able to understand what somebody was telling you. If you got bonked in the head and you had damage in Broca's area, and you couldn't make a sentence, you couldn't make a phrase, but you could understand what somebody was telling you, then that would be Broca's aphasia. So sometimes when people have strokes, for example, they'll have either Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia. Sometimes they just have generalized aphasia. When they do, they generally have right or left side weakness. So, but that was all backing up, you know, and consistent with Chomsky's idea of the language acquisition device. So you remember the 5-year critical period in the beginning? Well, language follows that as well. Okay, neuroplasticity is highest in the first 5 years. Language acquisition is critical in the first 5 years. Kids need to be speaking well before they're age 5, or you can start to see lifelong language deficits. It's just like if you are exposed to a second language before age 5, your ability to develop the intuitive sense for how to speak that language and understand it comes naturally. You don't have to translate. You don't have to learn, memorize. It just it happens naturally. But you know, if your first exposure to a language is in your high school Spanish class or German class, it's a whole different process. It's not acquired at that point. You have to actually hear the language, memorize it, practice it, and be able to retrieve it with retrieval cues. And so you can see it requires a great deal more brain tissue, and it's a great deal more complex. So that's why early exposure, if you want to expose kids to a variety of dialects and a variety of languages, you want to do that at a very, very early age. It's better if they're exposed to second languages and dialects before their 5th birthday. And that includes formal speech, because formal speech is in any language is the formalized version of that language. And then we all have our dialects, regional dialects, family dialects. Those are the accompanying versions or flavors of that speech. So now there's a myth that dialects degrade language. They don't. Dialects exist alongside whatever language you speak. So let's, for example, you have a family or neighborhood dialect that you speak. Being able to speak formally is not going to interfere with your family or neighborhood dialect, and vice versa. So if you tend to speak in a more of a slang family dialect, that isn't going to affect at all your ability to speak in a formal language. Also, we tend to understand a great deal more than we can say. So it's hard to judge somebody on how they speak, because they may be a great deal more intelligent than or more verbally proficient in understanding than they are in speaking. That's common in environments where kids grow up with very limited exposure to formal English or vocabulary, but they still have exposure to the ability to understand it because they see TV and all that. They're just not required to speak it. And so that's why speaking and understanding get really important, and a variety of dialects to give them flexibility in the world. So if you look at what dialects are, they're made up of phonemes, which are the basic sounds of a language. This gives you your accent, and it's your repertoire of sounds for a given language. We have a variety of phonemes when we're babbling as very young children that we're going to lose later on, because you're going to prune off the unnecessary phonemes. And that's why when people acquire a language before age 5, they tend to acquire the phonemes for that language. So they'll acquire all of the accent and sounds of that language and speak it more like a native. As opposed to somebody that's learning a language much later on, they'll speak that language with a strong accent for another language, or the phonemes for another language. Morphemes are the basic meanings of a language, and as you've probably run into from time to time, there are things that you can say in one language that you may not be able to say easily in another. So languages don't always directly translate. That's why they have interpreters and translators. And interpreters are people who can tell you, well, this is what this person means. Translators are people that say that they can tell you, this is what this person is saying. And so they'd make literal translations. But sometimes it's necessary to interpret. The only problem is that, you know, that puts an interpretation puts someone else's perspective, history, and perceptions in between the speaker and the listener. So it's not always what you want. When I was in the Army, I was having to do assessments and examinations on Iraqi detainees in the detainee ops section. These were people that they had a suspicion may be mentally ill or had some kind of a psychological problem. They didn't know whether they were, you know, for real or whether they were faking it or whatever. And I had an interpreter. And the problem is I needed literal translations, and the interpreters, you know, sometimes struggled with trying to figure out how to get that person's sentence into English without, you know, putting their own perspective on it. So that was always a challenge, but my interpreter got much, much better at it as we went along. When I explained to him, I need a literal translation. You know, I need you to tell me exactly what they said as close to you can get it into English. And so formal language is really important here, because there's kids that grow up in impoverished environments where in the school system they're not put in a position where they really need to speak formally sometimes. So it's easy to ignore the need to get them to speak formally. And that's why speech making is actually extremely important all the way through elementary, junior high, and high school, so that they get practiced at speaking formally. Because they're always going to have their own dialects, and there may be a variety of them in their neighborhood with their parents, family members. What gets left out sometimes, the formal dialect, and that's why it gets really important for them to acquire a formal dialect. So that's something to consider when you're really looking at school curricula and things like that. There's also kind of an anxiety that comes when somebody doesn't have real good skills at formal language. Then they'll have a lot of anxiety in their first speech class in college because they're acutely aware of how they sound.